I've always admired people who are able to stand up for the heterodox position in the face of social pressure. This is why I was originally drawn to these communities, because I saw people putting forward a logically consistent, empirically compelling, radical evolutionary perspective that they understood would impose social costs on them for voicing. People like Ryan Falk, Sean Last, Libertarian Realist, Mr. Hair IQ, Jared Taylor, back in the day when I first got involved in some of this thought, these people had the courage of their convictions. They said what they thought was true. They persuaded a lot of people, in some respects, including myself, and they opened up new possibilities politically and just in terms of the way that we conceive of our position in the world. That takes courage. What's not so admirable is when you're already part of a dissident culture and you simply echo those positions that are the orthodox, heterodox views within your dissident community. That's not standing up to social pressure. That is virtue signaling, and it leads to virtue spiraling, where people simply double down harder and harder on those edgy positions that get, as a rule, social approbation within your community. This is NPC thinking. This is mimetic thinking. You let memes take over your brain based on these social dynamics instead of conscientiously putting together a worldview on the basis of reason and evidence and just your own rational thought and effort. There are obvious downsides to engaging in this kind of mimetic thought, NPC thinking. One is it creates a toxic culture. It divorces your dissident community from reality, and you can't plan for a future if you're not actually tuned into the empirical world as it is. That requires accepting positions that might run counter to your sentiments, at least as legitimate to consider. If you don't consider those opinions, you reject arguments with emotional responses saying like, oh, you're a coward if you think this, or you're some other ad hominem. You can't plan for a future if you can't respond to things rationally and empirically. The other downside is that these platforms are controlled effectively by intelligence agencies, and they can manipulate the trajectory of discourse based on artificial likes, artificial boosts of visibility or suppression of visibility. They control these factors that are key in developing this kind of mimetic thought. We emulate behaviors that get social approbation. And so when we see a bunch of likes on a comment, we think, oh, this is the popular position to hold. I will reiterate this position. The really honest people are out on the cutting edge of the thought of the community, and sometimes they'll say things that run counter, therefore, to the sentiments of the community. Someone like Ryan Falk has done this several times, and ultimately, because he is empirically grounded and rational, he's dragged a lot of people with him in his ideological shifts. If you want to resist that process, you are contributing to a toxic culture that can't get its model of the world right, and also you're contributing to an atmosphere that is very easy for the forces of the enemy to manipulate. You don't want to make yourself into controlled opposition because you want to engage in a kind of social porn of saying the edgy, satisfying thing, or rejecting outright arguments that run counter to those favored positions within your community. So obviously I'm saying this because my last video got a lot of dislikes because I argued for globalism. And let me just give one final argument before we move on to a related but slightly different topic for this week. Why do you need some form of global government or governance? Because technology may one day come out with some doomsday device or something that threatens the existence of the species. We develop new technologies, we don't know what the implication of them will be until they're applied. And if you have a decentralized world with multiple nation states all developing their own technology. There's no mechanism for controlling the development of technology, and that means if there's any doomsday device waiting there to be uncovered, eventually somebody's going to find it and perhaps employ it, and this runs an existential risk. You can't control the development of technology. You can't suppress something like AI or transhumanism or whatever high-tech future you're afraid of seeing. You can't prevent it unless you have some kind of global regime that can effectively direct the course of technological development. So it's ironic that you have a lot of nationalists who are anti-technology. Well, how can you possibly influence the development of technology as a nationalist? You can't. There's also a strategic deficit in the nationalist position in that the globalists are out there interacting in all nations, pushing for their global agenda. Meanwhile, as a nationalist, you just want to look within and look to the fate of your people. History will act on you even if you don't want to project yourself out into world history. So the globalists are thinking about everyone, the nationalists are thinking only about themselves. This is an asymmetry that can be exploited to the advantage of the globalist. Now, the topic for this week is what kind of global order would you like? And nationalism is an option there. But if you want to preserve a future for individual ethnicities or individual nations, you have to find a way of cooperating as national identities. This is, by the way, what the nationalists tend to do now. They operate in the same intellectual circles. They use the same arguments. American nationalists influence European nationalism. There's a community of nationalists that are looking for a certain kind of global order. Like, this is the Duginist position, right? The multipolar world. They have a global vision that they want to accomplish. And you have to engage in that kind of thought to have a long-term end goal that you're looking for with your political action. So the question to you, the topic for this discussion for this week, for those people on Peer Academy who are signed up for it, and the link will be in the description. If you want to be added to the discussion list, go ahead and message me on Peer Academy. I will add you and you'll have a discussion partner to talk about the weekly topic. And regardless, you can show up for the group chat that we have in my Discord. We'll do Saturday morning about 10 a.m. next Saturday for this week. And I guess that'll just be the running time weekly, 10 a.m. on Saturdays. But anyway, the question for you for this week is, what kind of global order do you want? Now, I have thoughts on this, and so I'll share my thoughts. These are not commonly held positions, but I think that my solution to the global situation has certain inherent advantages, and it solves not only the problem of restricting technological development or directing it, but also the problem of automation and providing some kind of living for people who won't be able to compete in the job market in the face of automation and AI. And that is basically with the introduction of some kind of distributivist global paradigm. There are many ways of doing this specifically. Obviously, in order to have the ability to do this, you have to have already some kind of global regime. The way to achieve that is a mixture of the diplomacy, cooperation with other nations, forming larger blocs, and the way sort of that the EU has come about, and they're gradually approaching more direct military cooperation and kind of the blending of sovereignty into one superstructure. There's been tendencies against that in the EU, but that was the long-term trend since the 90s, when it was just an economic thing, to they're developing more and more interconnected forms of bureaucracy and infrastructure and legal systems. So something like that is one aspect, and also just direct imposition of your political will on the global stage, suppressing rogue regimes, replacing rogue dictatorships with governments that want to fit into this kind of global order. The UN is one path towards this, but I don't support the globalists that exist now. I would rather try to conceive of a global order that is populist, ultimately, that the people want. And I think the UN, if it got its global hegemony solidified to the point where it becomes indistinguishable from global government, they wouldn't distribute the land. They would suppress the population like they say they want to. I don't think that kind of suppression is necessary. That means a dead end for most people genetically on this planet. That means, your quality of life and the power that you're able to exert in the world will be just gradually suppressed until you're nothing. Basically, you will be stomped into the ground until you don't exist. That's the future of the globalists for most people, unless you're part of that elite. So they push for things like libertarian capitalism, open borders, the open society of Karl Popper or George Soros. That's what they're looking for, and it is to the benefit of the elite to have that. Now, is there a good argument that by doing this, they will be able to regulate the development of technology and steer humanity into a sustainable future, respond to existential threats from outside of the planet, asteroids, respond to something like supervolcanoes? There's all sorts of natural disasters that could happen that will kill us eventually if we don't have some kind of coordinated capacity for a response. Also, they'll be able to potentially regulate the development of technology to prevent our own suicide or omnicide. So that's a powerful argument for some form of globalism. I think that's their justification. Why is it okay for them to suppress the working classes and poor of the world indefinitely? Because it's what's necessary for human survival. And I think that's why they don't care about mixing up populations. They are trying to get rid of the working class in the West anyway, because that represents a threat to their power structure. So they don't care about mixing everyone up. They're just planning on suppressing everyone reproductively anyway. So the demographic future of a given race is just not their concern. They're concerned about the elites who are already in this club. It's a relatively small number. They already know each other. They are very well connected, and they're pushing for this. Now, in opposition, what you would want is some kind of political ideology of a global scale. This is what communism does, right? It says the workers of the world unite, the proletariat unite around the world in their own interest. This means collectivizing the means of production. Now, the communist way of doing this tends to result in a tyranny, a global tyranny. A distributivist order has more potential for a kind of multipolarity in the sense that power centers will grow up in opposition to one another, but it's a matter of balancing these powers in a way that still allows for certain critical issues to be regulated globally versus like suppressing any regional power center and basically just filtering up high competence people into a single bureaucracy and everything centrally planned. There are problems with central planning at a global scale. You don't want that. You want the best of the market solution, and you also want the best of global regulation that allows you to prevent the extinction of the species. So this is the kind of political thought that I like to toy with. One thing that I've thought about is a global land credit. This can solve the population problem, because if it's once and for all instituted that each person on the planet gets one land credit, land purchases can only be done through land credits. There are other ways of doing this where you don't appropriate the land of any current holders. You can wait until people die and buy off their land with other forms of wealth. You can prevent like intergenerational land transfers to eventually get to this point where you can get a more or less even distribution of land. But if that land credit is automatically just passed to next of kin, and you never get more as the generations go on, then those families that control their reproduction and just have a replacement rate have this fixed amount of land that they will keep. Those bloodlines that are irresponsible with their reproduction and increase beyond the allotment will find it harder and harder to sustain themselves. So this provides a reward for reproductive constraint and a punishment for reproductive excess. So that's one problem this land credit idea can solve. The other is the thing that UBI seeks to address in the face of automation. So if you have this land credit, you can either use the land as a subsistence farmer to sustain yourself, or you can lease it out to some corporation or other entity that will pay you for the use of that land. So this is an inalienable source of income for people into the future. It also provides a mechanism for establishing regional governmental entities. If you keep freedom of association and allow people to pool their credits together to form basically social contract states, corporate states, then whatever your nationalist vision is, you can voluntarily get together and enact it. And it has the advantage of basically making the social contract a reality, where you give the credit that you have to a corporate structure, a pseudo-state structure that you agree with, and you have the ability to leave if you don't agree with it in the future. I think this is a good balance between the rights of communities to exist unmolested, to preserve their own membranes, their own borders, and it's also a way to preserve like individual freedom. It's a voluntarist solution to pseudo-state formation, national formation, and I think it allows the nationalists to get everything they really care about. The only thing you don't preserve is the right of a nation to make war on another nation. And if that's ultimately what you care about as a nationalist, you might as well be an imperialist globalist who says my national identity ought to impose itself on the world. Because if you want the ability to conquer other nations, that's what you care about as a nationalist, then just try to conquer all the other nations and impose that global order that you want. You can justify it because if we don't have some kind of global order, we'll likely kill ourselves. And whatever your aesthetic vision is, even if it involves preserving other peoples, the only way to ensure that is to take control at a global scale for yourself. So this land credit solution, it would have to be administered by some kind of global bureaucracy. And the way to regulate the guardians of this kind of system is through total transparency. So the way that Plato thinks of the guardian class in his Republic is something to emulate here, where the guardians live in quarters that are publicly accessible. They don't have private property. And we have the technology now to, if you want to be part of this global technocratic structure, you join and you're constantly surveilled. And that's what you pay as a cost for wanting to take part in the planning of humanity as a whole. There can be benefits for participating in some kind of global technocracy, but basically some kind of meritocratic system where, it's similar to the old corporate model where you enter in as an entry-level employee and you kind of work your way up the hierarchy. Something like that with an academic dimension where if you want to go study, you can kind of work your way up through professorships to like more bureaucratic responsibility, but partaking in this structure as a whole entails that you give up your privacy. You are a public citizen basically at that point. So it would be a trade-off, and basically you have these sorts of guardians monitoring one another. The technology exists to allow them to monitor one another. I'm not saying it's a foolproof solution, but you have to think, how is some kind of global order going to be structured? And I think with mass populist appeal, if basically you created some kind of ideology that spread massively, that you found ways of networking and getting this idea into every area of the world, every continent, every people, you have representatives spreading this message. If you can get a vast global majority supporting this kind of future, distributist future with an open, transparent, meritocratic technocracy governing the development of humanity, then you can basically create a demand on the current elite saying there's overwhelming support for this alternative system. We don't want you globalists anymore. So that's what I would want to shoot for. I'm not a current globalist supporter. I'm a populist globalist who thinks there's a better path forward using some of these ideas like distributivism, which is originally a Catholic idea. And that idea has been floating around in these circles for years. The idea of kind of explicit social contracts, voluntarism, corporate government, that's been floating around these circles for years. And the kind of open technocracy, I look at that as what Plato was really advocating for. So I think it's an interesting model, an interesting idea for how I'd like the future to look at a global scale. What do you want the globe to look like in the future? I think it's a worthwhile question to entertain, to think logically about it, to criticize visions that are put out there, including mine. And by doing this, I think we can orient our political thinking to some kind of goal in the long run. If you're just a nationalist and you're just concerned about your nation, what about the future of humanity, 1,000 years from now, 5,000 years from now, if we ever get off the planet? You have to be able to think about that large, future of humanity question, structure of global power question, if you want to have a, coherent, logical, really meaningful political position. Because people sense that. If you're just a nationalist, you only care about your own people, it's kind of irrational. Like, why do you just care about your nation? You have to rely on irrational justifications at that point, and it won't persuade everyone. So if you want to have a really compelling worldview, you have to answer all of these questions. Right now, the globalists have an answer for some of these questions, and with their emphasis on climate change and things like that, they are recruiting people to their side. There are a lot of people around the world who support the UN. There are also a lot of people who don't understand what the UN is really aiming at. So I think the truth is on the side of those who would come up with some kind of alternative globalism, a populist globalism. That's what I advocate. Thank you for listening.